They tell you the world is rich. They tell you growth will save us. But here's the uncomfortable question no one wants to ask. If every country is drowning in debt, who is standing on the shore holding the receipt? In the next few minutes, you're going to see the global economy from an angle most people never notice. Not as nations and currencies, but as a machine. One designed to move value upward while convincing everyone below that this is normal. Because debt isn't just a number. Debt is a relationship, and every relationship has power. The United States owes more money than it has ever produced. China, Japan, Europe, all the same story. Trillions stacked on trillions. And yet the system hasn't collapsed. That alone should make you suspicious. Here's the tension. Debt is supposed to be temporary. You borrow, you repay, it ends. But global debt never ends. It only grows year after year, crisis after crisis. So ask yourself this. If the debt can never be fully paid back, why does the system demand more of it? This is where the story turns uncomfortable. Because modern debt doesn't behave like personal debt. It doesn't come from savings. It comes from permission. When governments borrow, money is created at the moment of borrowing. Not found, not earned, created. But only part of it. The principal appears. The interest does not. That missing piece is the pressure point. It forces new borrowing just to keep the system breathing. And whoever controls that pressure controls the flow of wealth. This isn't incompetence, it's architecture. In this video, we're not chasing villains or fantasies. We're following incentives. We're tracing ownership. If everyone owes, someone owns. History already tells us what happens next, and it never ends quietly. And by the end, you'll understand why real power doesn't sit in elections, but in balance sheets people never look at. Because once you see who the creditor is, you can't unsee what comes next after this. Here's the first illusion you need to let go of. Most people think debt works like a household loan. Someone saves money, someone else borrows it. Time passes, it gets paid back. End of story. That story is comforting and completely wrong. Modern sovereign debt doesn't come from stored wealth. It comes from authorization, from keystrokes, from ledger entries that turn promises into currency. When a government needs money, it doesn't wait for someone to save it. It issues bonds. And the act of issuing those bonds creates money that did not exist seconds before. This is where tension enters the system. Because when that money is created, only the base amount is born, not the cost of borrowing it, not the interest that will be demanded forever. Imagine a machine that prints $1 trillion, then immediately requires $1.05 trillion to be returned. That extra $50 billion doesn't exist anywhere in the system. So where does it come from? From more borrowing? From future promises. From pulling value out of the real economy. This is the quiet trap. The math ensures that debt must expand or the system seizes. If borrowing slows, defaults begin. If defaults spread, everything breaks. So debt growth isn't encouraged, it's required. And this is why global debt never shrinks. Not after wars, not after crashes, not after recessions. Every crisis demands more borrowing to fix the last one. Now ask the dangerous question. If money is created through debt, who receives the interest? Because interest is not neutral. It's not abstract. It moves somewhere, to someone. Every year, trillions flow upward through invisible channels. Taxes, mortgages, credit cards, corporate loans, student debt. Most people feel the pressure but never see the destination. That's intentional. Because once you trace where interest payments actually land, the system stops looking chaotic and starts looking coordinated. And the most revealing part? The largest holders of debt don't look like villains. They look like institutions, quiet, technical, boring. Until you realize institutions don't own themselves. And the moment you ask who stands behind them, the picture sharpens fast. That's where we go next. Now we reach the first layer of the answer, and it's the one most people stop at: central banks. They're presented as neutral referees, guardians of stability, technical institutions run by economists in suits. No politics, no profit motive, just math. That image is powerful and misleading. Central banks are the foundation of the debt system because they are the first buyers. When governments issue bonds, central banks step in and purchase massive portions of that debt using newly created money. This is how governments spend beyond taxes. Wars, bailouts, stimulus, emergency programs, none of it works without central banks absorbing government debt. So here's the hook. If central banks hold trillions in government bonds and collect interest on them, who ultimately benefits from that interest? Because central banks don't float in space. They have ownership structures, legal frameworks, profit distribution rules. Take the US Federal Reserve. It's not a government department. It's a network of regional banks with private member banks holding shares. Those shares pay guaranteed dividends. That doesn't mean cartoon villains in a room. It means incentives quietly embedded in law. The same pattern appears elsewhere. The Bank of England began as a private institution lending to the crown. Other central banks evolved differently, but the core mechanism remains. Create money, buy government debt, receive interest. Now pause here because this is critical. Central banks don't keep all that interest forever. Some flows back to governments, some doesn't, and more importantly, their actions set the price of money itself. Interest rates decide who can borrow cheaply and who cannot, who survives downturns and who collapses, who refinances and who defaults. That power is enormous. But here's the twist most people miss. Central banks only hold a fraction of global debt. A meaningful fraction, yes, but not the majority. They are the keystone, not the pyramid. If you stop here, you miss the real structure, because behind central banks sit institutions that dwarf them in scale. Quiet giants, asset managers, funds so large they shape markets by existing. And once we move into that layer, the story stops being abstract economics and starts looking like concentrated control hiding behind paperwork. That's where the real weight of the $317 trillion sits. And it's closer to your retirement account than you think. This is where the debt story stops sounding theoretical. Because the next layer doesn't live in textbooks. It lives inside pensions, insurance policies, and investment funds that touch nearly every working person on Earth. Institutional investors. These are the largest holders of debt in the modern world. Pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, and sovereign wealth funds. Together, they hold well over a third of all global debt. On the surface, this feels reassuring. Pensions sound like workers. Insurance sounds like protection. Mutual funds sound democratic. But ownership and control are not the same thing. Workers may fund pensions, but they don't decide how those trillions are deployed. That power sits with fund managers, whose incentives are tied to asset growth, not social stability. Insurance companies collect premiums from millions of people, then invest that money into debt instruments that generate steady interest. That interest doesn't flow back evenly. It flows upward through shareholders and executive compensation. And then there are the giants, asset managers so large that governments consult them during crises, firms that manage more money than most countries produce in a year. Their business model is simple: preserve capital, generate yield, avoid volatility. Debt is perfect for that. Every government bond, every corporate loan, every mortgage-backed security becomes a small stream of interest feeding an ocean of capital. And here's the uncomfortable part. The ownership of these institutions is heavily concentrated. A small percentage of households own the overwhelming majority of financial assets, stocks, bonds, funds. So when interest flows into these institutions, it doesn't spread out, it pools, slowly, relentlessly. This is why inequality grows even when economies grow. The system rewards those positioned as creditors, not producers. But this still isn't the top, because institutions are intermediaries. They manage money. They don't ultimately own it. To see the full picture, we have to cross borders, because some of the largest creditors to the world are not private at all. They are states. And once you understand why governments lend to other governments, you'll see how global trade locks nations into permanent dependency. That's the next layer. Now we zoom out beyond institutions and into geopolitics, because nations themselves are creditors. Foreign governments hold tens of trillions in other countries' debt, especially US debt. And this isn't charity, it's structure. Here's how it works. When one country exports far more than it imports, it ends up holding the buyer's currency. Those dollars don't sit idle, they're recycled back into government bonds. So the exporter lends the money back to the importer. On the surface, it looks balanced. One side gets cheap goods, the other gets safe assets. But underneath, it creates a quiet dependency loop. The importing country must keep borrowing to maintain consumption. The exporting country must keep lending to protect the value of the currency it holds. Neither side can easily stop. And inside these lending governments, the benefits don't reach everyone equally. The bonds aren't owned by factory workers or farmers. They're controlled by state agencies and political elites who decide how reserves are used. This means entire populations work to generate surplus value that gets locked into foreign debt instruments managed by a narrow group at the top. It's wealth concentration with a flag attached. But here's the reveal. Even governments aren't the final destination. They are vehicles. Behind institutions, behind states, behind funds, there is one class that consistently ends up on the winning side of every debt cycle. They don't need growth. They don't need productivity miracles. They only need time. Because time plus interest does the work for them. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for people who believe wealth always comes from innovation or labor. Because the largest creditors in the world don't build, they lend. And once you see how this group positions itself during booms and collapses alike, the system's true purpose becomes impossible to ignore. That group is next. This is the layer people whisper about, but rarely analyze clearly. Wealthy individuals and family offices, not celebrities, not tech founders and headlines, quiet dynasties, multi-generational capital, money that doesn't need to take risks because it already won. When you reach a certain level of wealth, the game changes. You stop chasing growth. You chase preservation, stability, predictable return. Debt is perfect for that. Government bonds, corporate bonds, structured credit, assets designed not to build the future, but to skim it. Here's the key shift. A worker earns income once. A business earns profit only if it keeps performing. But a creditor earns continuously, regardless of who succeeds or fails below them. Interest doesn't care if wages stagnate. It doesn't care if productivity slows. It gets paid first. And this is why extreme wealth concentrates over time. The top fraction of households hold a massive share of financial assets, not because they're more productive, but because interest compounds while labor does not. A family with billions doesn't need to invent anything new. They allocate capital into debt instruments and collect streams of income generated by other people's effort. Taxes fund interest on government bonds. Workers fund interest on corporate debt. Families fund interest on mortgages and loans. All of it flows upward. And the more they receive, the more they reinvest, which means even more interest next year and the year after that. This is compounding power. Now pause here because this is critical. This system doesn't require corruption. It doesn't require secret meetings. It doesn't require coordination. It only requires rules that favor creditors and time. That's why it survived for centuries across empires, religions, and ideologies. Monarchies, democracies, capitalism, socialism. Different labels, same structure. Those who lend shape the system. Those who borrow adopt to it. And once you understand that, you realize something unsettling. Crises don't threaten this class. Crises serve it. Because when debtors break, assets don't disappear. They change hands. And the people with liquidity, patience, and protection are always ready to buy. That's not theory. That's history repeating. And history is about to repeat again. Every system reveals its true purpose during collapse. And debt systems collapse in a very specific way. When borrowers can't pay, assets don't vanish. Homes, land, businesses, infrastructure, they are transferred. This is where history stops being a lesson and becomes a warning. In medieval Europe, kings borrowed to fight wars. When they couldn't repay, land moved into the hands of lenders. Entire regions shifted ownership without a single battle. In the Great Depression, farmers lost land not because they stopped working, but because credit dried up. Those with cash bought everything at fractions of its value. In 2008, millions defaulted on mortgages. Who bought the homes? Not families, funds, institutions, capital pools that waited for the moment stress peaked. The pattern is precise. Expansion pulls people into debt. Collapse pushes assets upward. And because the wealthy hold claims, not obligations, they are positioned to benefit both ways. This is why the system doesn't rush to prevent crises, it manages them. Central banks intervene just enough to stabilize creditors. Governments bail out institutions deemed too important. Households absorb the shock. Debt doesn't disappear. It consolidates. Now look at the present. Global debt is larger than global output. Interest payments are rising faster than wages. Governments roll debt instead of repaying it. Households stretch longer and longer. This isn't sustainable. Everyone knows it. But the question isn't whether it breaks, it's who is protected when it does. The wealthy don't hold their position in one currency. They diversify across borders, assets, jurisdictions. They prepare for volatility. The middle class holds mortgages, local currency savings, and fixed incomes. When inflation hits, savings erode. When defaults rise, jobs vanish. When austerity arrives, services shrink. The system extracts during growth and reorganizes ownership during collapse. That's not accidental. Which leads to the final illusion. People think the end of the debt cycle will bring justice. History shows it brings consolidation. And the next part explains why the math guarantees that outcome, no matter which solution governments choose. When people finally admit the system is breaking, they immediately argue about solutions. Default, inflation, debt forgiveness. It sounds like a debate. It isn't. Because every solution follows the same hidden script. Start with default. If governments or corporations stop paying, bondholders take losses on paper. But paper losses aren't real losses if you control liquidity. The moment assets are seized, privatized, or sold to stabilize the system, buyers with cash step in. Who has cash during crises? Creditors. Defaults don't erase wealth, they transfer ownership. Now, inflation. Inflation doesn't cancel debt, it quietly shifts who pays it. Wages lag, savings lose value, fixed income households fall behind. Meanwhile, asset owners watch prices rise while their debt shrinks in real terms. Inflation is a tax on those who save in currency. and a gift to those who hold assets. Again, the outcome is concentration. Now, debt forgiveness, the option that sounds revolutionary. Historically, debt jubilees don't erase hierarchy, they reset it. Debts are cleared, but new systems are built immediately. And who designs the new rules? The same class that survived the collapse with capital intact. Every reset wipes out the middle layer, small owners, savers, independent producers. What remains are large entities and dependent populations. This is why the elite don't fear endings. They plan for transitions. They hedge currencies. They hold land, infrastructure, resources, things that survive policy changes. The average person holds promises, accounts, numbers on screens. So when the debt system reaches its mathematical limit, the question isn't will it end, it's what replaces it. And history gives a disturbing answer. Each reset centralizes control further. Fewer owners, larger institutions, less independence. Which means the real power move isn't predicting collapse. It's understanding who will be positioned to write the next system. And once you see that, the $317 trillion figure stops being scary. It becomes a countdown. Because debt doesn't need to be repaid for creditors to win. It only needs to exist long enough to pull assets upward before being restructured. And that restructuring is already being discussed quietly in rooms most people will never enter. The final part answers the original question fully. Not just who the lender is, but why this system was built to make sure it's always the same one. So here's the full picture. The $317 trillion in global debt isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's a map of power. Who are the lenders? 4 layers working together, often without coordination, yet producing the same outcome. 1. Central banks, the keystone. They create money and buy government debt, enabling perpetual borrowing. They set the terms of interest and the rules for the rest of the system. 2. Institutional investors, pensions, insurance companies, mutual funds. They manage trillions on behalf of others, but control rests with a small management elite. The interest flows upward, not outward. 3. Foreign governments. They hold other nations' debt to protect trade balances, currencies, and influence. Citizens fund these holdings without seeing the benefit. 4. Wealthy individuals and dynasties, the apex. They own the bonds, the funds, the structures. They earn interest continuously. They compound wealth while millions remain borrowers. The debt system is a pipeline. From middle-class paychecks, corporate profits, and taxes, to fund managers' bonuses, to dynasties collecting interest without producing anything tangible. And it's designed to be invisible, to appear natural, to convince 8 billion people that they are borrowers by choice, that paying interest is inevitable, that the game is fair. Except it isn't. Interest doesn't disappear when money is spent. It accumulates. Compound interest ensures that small differences grow into insurmountable wealth gaps over decades. And remember, the system is mathematically trapped. Money is created for principal. Interest is not. Debt must grow to exist, which means creditors can always win if they survive the cycles long enough. The rest of the world, workers, households, small businesses, bear the burden. They borrow, they pay, they fund the growth of others without realizing it. And it's been this way for centuries, from the Medici to the Rothschilds, from JP Morgan to today's billionaires. Lending builds dynasties, borrowing fuels nations, but the direction of wealth never reverses. And yet, almost no one understands this when they buy a home, take a loan, or invest in a 401k. Because the system is global, totalizing, unforgiving. But there's one final truth that most miss. The very design of debt ensures that even when the system collapses, the lenders win again. The top few million always benefit. Always. The borrowers, they rebuild, refinance, and often re-enter the same system. Here's the conclusion everyone avoids. The $317 trillion debt system isn't a mistake. It isn't temporary. It's a machine. A machine built to concentrate wealth across centuries, across crises, across continents. Every mortgage, every student loan, every corporate bond, every government bond, it's part of the same invisible conveyor belt. Money flows up, power flows up, influence flows up. Interest is the engine, time is the amplifier, and the wealthy, the apex of the system, are the operators. When crises hit, they don't panic, they act. They buy collapsed assets, they restructure debt to their advantage, they diversify holdings globally, they survive every reset intact. Meanwhile, the middle class loses, small investors lose, borrowers bear the burden. Yet society convinces itself this is inevitable, natural, just the way the economy works. But it isn't. It was designed this way. Now ask yourself, if everyone owes, who benefits? Who holds the power? The answer is clear: a tiny global elite. Families, dynasties, institutions, central banks, working through layers of control, influence, and compounding interest. And this isn't theory, it's history. From the Medici to the Rothschilds, from JP Morgan to today's mega billionaires, the pattern repeats, perpetually, relentlessly, predictably. The final lesson? Awareness is the first defense. Once you see the system for what it is, you can start planning, protecting yourself, understanding how wealth flows. Not just how to earn it, but how to survive a system built to favor the few every single day. Because the $317 trillion in debt isn't going away. The interest doesn't stop. The transfers continue. And the question remains, will you be part of the borrowers or understand the game and position yourself wisely? This is the system. The lenders have always been ahead, and now so can you, if you choose to see it.